So we are recording now. And our first question to get us started is, what are some challenges and successes that you've witnessed abroad as it relates to sustainability?
Do you want us to just jump right in?
Yeah, sure.
Well, I guess, the thing that this is, I guess a success, I'll start with the success. One thing that I've really enjoyed in doing study abroad programs as well, like short-term and semester-long programs and research, is the kind of different way of living that we see, and often a much more sustainable way of living in other countries. So for instance, I'm particularly interested in often the kind of vibrant, maybe high-density, multi-use cities that you might find in places like Hong Kong or Singapore or Amsterdam or Copenhagen, the list goes on. But the ability to see in action things that we learn about, and it's hard to imagine them being implemented, and we see them happening in other places, like going to Copenhagen or Amsterdam and traveling around with your students on bicycles, and not being terrified. And so those kinds of things I think are real, real successes that we can learn from.
I can go next. So my experience when I did field work in India was about how people who don't have electricity will actually adopt renewable sources of electricity, especially if they can't connect to the main electricity grid that's being offered. If you offer them solutions, say, that involve solar lamps, for instance, it was incredible to see the uptake, the interest in some of those solutions. And there were real possibilities of this being like a very comprehensive solution. So it really, for me, in terms of success, this would be like a very classic case that I've actually witnessed. In terms of challenges, and it is also related to this particular use of renewable energy in a developing country like India, would be the single biggest issue that affects people's decision-making capabilities at the household level is unfortunately cost. And to the extent that coal is cheaper than renewable sources of energy, which it still is, it is always the case that power from the electricity grid is going to trump these off-grid solutions. So, but we found ways or creative ways through like subsidies to try and get people to adopt renewable sources. But the issue of cost and prices is always paramount and the biggest challenge for us.
Mm.
I would say amongst successes I've seen in my limited experience so far is just really the chance for students to get to see the other end of the global supply chain that we all benefit from with our devices and all the stuff we have in our homes and cars and whatnot, and to meet the people who are involved in producing those things, and as well as considering the policy and ecological and other and economic implications of those choices that we make on the ground at the other end. So that's a positive sort of eye-opening thing. I think that, in terms of challenges, it's a matter of, we're in our program anyway, we're talking about global sustainability, and when that takes on an international component, we have simply the impact of our educational program that to think about. And so, I feel more comfortable. I think it's more of a path to success to be using study abroad to solve global problems, as opposed to simply seeing the stuff that we see here, but seeing it in a different context.
I think one of the things which I've been heartened by is just the trend of the last decade to embed sustainability into research and study abroads. driven primarily by students. I think your awareness of these issues has led to changes in programming. But I also think it's been helpful as a throughput because it helps us to think about trade-offs. And I think we're going to discuss that later on as well. But I remember before we went to Guatemala, we talked about different trade-offs and different opportunities to leap existing infrastructure, right? And we were talking about some of the benefits of different transportation approaches. But that's a nice conversation to have when we're in some ways a place that has highly developed infrastructure. And then we were in Guatemala when we saw the limits of the highways or the road structures, and when there's a problem with the roads, how a 2-hour journey can lead to an 18-hour travel trip because you lack just existing pipelines for what we consider kind of older technology, trucks, cars, transport. It changes the dynamic and the trade-offs pretty quickly. But being able to have that frame as we approach these questions in our programs, I think is quite helpful and quite valuable. So that's one thing I've been heartened to see the last decade. No matter what programs we've been engaged in, just this broader emphasis of how sustainability touches, whether it's migration or food systems or issues of national security on the political space. There's questions of sustainability that are embedded in all of them, which makes it kind of exciting touch point and throughput that takes these issues or study broads that may be more isolated, but connects it back to a larger whole.
Yeah, and that kind of leads us into our next question perfectly, David. You kind of talked about the cultural shift here we're seeing at William & Mary and at UVA. But are there any cultural shifts in sustainability you've witnessed in your travels abroad? And even when people begin to care, what kind of barriers might exist to prohibit those changes from happening?
I'll start it off since I held back for last time. I think for me, oftentimes it goes back to priorities versus needs. And I think depending on where the study abroad is located, you can see different engagements with this question of sustainability. I think when the term is explained, I think there's value that no matter where we are, culturally or economically or socially, that people apply to a sustainable life, but you may give emphasis on different spectrums. I think before this meeting, we were talking about when you go to Europe, oftentimes hard to get that disposable water bottle, plastic. Even at William & Mary, I think we've now put in protocols that we can't have plastic water bottles by a certain date. And maybe UVA is the same way, but that's becoming extinct. You cannot get a plastic water bottle. Whereas in Guatemala, like that is really valuable because what is that plastic water bottle symbol? Clean water. So portable water that you can take with you, that's safe drinking water. And that is more valuable, even if you have the residue of the plastic, than drinking from water that may not be safe or sanitary when you think about possible for disease, your family, what it means health-wise. So I think that's one of the exposures when you think about sustainability is depending on where you sit determines what you prioritize. And that has implications for expenditures, for resources, for infrastructure development.
Yeah, I think David makes a great point about the trade-off between needs versus wants. In my experience, like when you go to really poor places in India, and these are places which don't have electricity, don't have heat during the winter, and those people who live in these places, so for instance, if they're looking for heat when it's cold, they'll go to and chop firewood from trees that are near their homes. This is really problematic because once it starts raining, you're really risking erosion of the soil, and there's so much of other kinds of effects that will come down the road. But culturally, one of the things that over time, even I, as a researcher, have come to accept is that there are very clear differences in the way people make decisions, and that the way they make decisions are very different from the way I would make decisions. So for instance, people who live in this area, they make decisions really on the short term, that if they do not cut to firewood they're going to die of heat in the night. So they are in the cold. So they really need the heat. So they don't have the luxury of thinking 2 months ahead and try to take into account what they're going to do when rainfall season begins. So for me, cultural issues are always tricky to navigate when it comes to sustainability. And for us, as part of like working with study abroad, really means working with the cultural issues, at least from my perspective.
Following on the India example, I was thinking about shifts that I've seen happening as I go back to places where I'm doing research or studying. And I was thinking the first time I visited India for a research project was in 1993. And at that time, I was so incredibly impressed by the material use and reuse of things like the unfired clay chai cups that you would get on the train lines. And in southern India, especially banana leaves, where your thali, your meal would be served on that banana leaf, and then you would fold it, when you were done, you would fold it up and it would be composted. It would be fed to, animals, and the food residue was actually nourishment for some other creature. And, I came back just amazed by that kind of attitude toward material use in India. And that really was very formative for me. And then I didn't go for a long time. And then I started going back every year, starting in 2010 for about 5 years. And each time I saw this dramatic loss of that, especially the first time I went back, where the clay small cups were replaced by plastic cups that were littering the railway lines everywhere. The solid waste problem had just totally gotten out of control because no longer were compostable natural materials being used, but plastic had replaced these things. And, and it was just incredibly traumatizing, actually, to see that shift, which to me was such a lesson. Now, though, I see that the Indian Railway and maybe Harish, you're a lot more knowledgeable about this, but now those clay cups are being brought back. And so to see that change over, I don't know, 20, 25-year period, where an idea about like throwaway culture and ease of use and all of those things went really far in one direction, and it now seems to be going back in the other direction. So I think that's a kind of initially a horrifying example, but then a really positive story.
That's
true. Similarly in Vietnam, and the thing that happens culturally is that folks were used to eating their meal and then throwing the wrapper in the street because it would be taken care of, it would be biodegraded before too much time. We have now new materials, but the same behavior. And that doesn't work with plastic bags and cups and so forth. So there is a need to change that. Fortunately, there are laws on the books that and goals for policy now that are to eliminate plastic bag use in some of the cities, but enforcement of fees and actual, steps to move in the direction of achieving those goals is lagging. So that's the hard part.
It really does kind of highlight, basic human rights and accessibility to, clean water and things like that, how it ties in with a lot of different aspects here, like sustainability and a few different things. So it is really interesting to see. So thank you guys. Any other thoughts on this question or how it might pertain to, why we might select one location over another, or things to consider before you go and visit one of these locations?
Well, I think it's important to learn what we can before going, so we, with the Study Abroad program for Vietnam anyway, we had a series of webinars before the course that occurred in the fall semester, and then we had our 2 weeks there. And, so we didn't spend much time at all, like getting acclimated to some sort of basic protocols and, what's the currency look like, and, how are things done differently, particularly in a very different political system than ours. And so that helped a lot. I mean, preparing ahead of time for anything you're going to do is a good idea, but particularly travel overseas, and when you've got a short period of time, you need to wring all the education and other experiences out of it that you can. You don't want to be, fumbling through several days of just trying to get your feet under you.
Yeah, I'll second the comment that about trying to help students basically learn cultural practices before they go into the field. I remember sitting down with my student who I took to India and having like an extended conversation about everything, right from eating to drinking, and what David mentioned about, how do you find clean water? How should you identify clean water? So all of those things I think would really help someone who goes on like a study abroad program to help ease in, but also be culturally aware about what is feasible and what is not, right? So we can't expect to change the world when certain cultural practices are really deep rooted, but we've got to find like creative solutions around it.
Yeah, and I think when possible, if we can travel or work with a partner who is from the area, I know that was really beneficial for us. And that way we were guests, not presuming we were bringing knowledge, but that relationship was one in which they were instructing and teaching us. And having that mindset, I think, was helpful for the students, that they were there to learn, and we had experts who were walking with us, and they could perform the translator function. I remember we were crossing one area, and we ended up having to pay a bribe to cross a bridge. And for many of our students, that was challenging because it was almost a front, right? Why would we have to pay money? And he was able to walk through the particular nuances of that community and why that would be necessary, and the disagreement between the local government and the district government, the national government, and who was responsible for infrastructure costs for that particular area. And he was able to depersonalize it a bit and talk about it in the larger cultural context. And I would have no concept of how to have done that without his leadership and his guidance. So I think that is quite helpful because as much as we like to read up or train, there's something that just comes from living your life in an area. Just as when people come over to spend time in Williamsburg, we just have the sense of our lives here, and be able to take the time to walk through that is really helpful. So I found that to be key, is who are those instructors and guides? And I think from us as instructors or other participants, if you all go out, study abroad, it's being willing to model that and to demonstrate that even if we're the instructor of record for study abroad class, that there's a lot of things that we are learning alongside you. And I found that to also be helpful in saying like, hey, I don't understand this. Can you walk me through it? To help the students know that we're in a very deep learning experience for a week, 2 weeks, for 9 weeks. And it's okay to be lost. And it's okay to be learning in these environments, that we don't need to presume, and with our 20 years, 30 years, 40 years experience from this particular spot in Williamsburg or Charlottesville, that naturally translates. But we can be, we're here at university to learn, and that's a great privilege we have, and we can kind of be comfortable in just being in that learning environment.
That's a great point, David. So with that, we're kind of at our halfway point. So as Marina may have said, we're going to jump into breakout rooms, but whether you turn your videos on or leave them off, that's totally up to you. We just ask that you engage thoughtfully in conversation. So the question today is there anything that you witnessed or learned from your time abroad that could be implemented here back at home? So we'll give you all about 4 minutes to have this conversation, and then we will bring everyone back. In your breakout rooms. And in an effort to keep things moving, I will pose another question for our panelists. So how would you encourage your students to have a positive relationship with local culture based on your experiences abroad?
Well, I guess for me, the idea is immersive, maybe. that it's about immersing oneself in the local culture and respecting the local culture, I think maybe is equally important. I mean, for me, like as an urbanist, taking public transportation is really important to understand how people move around and what their mobility issues are. You know, eating the local food, learning the language, or at least learning pleasantries if you don't know the language. You know, not so much not trying to fit in, because of course that's never going to fully happen, but at least attempting to understand and follow practices that are acceptable maybe in that culture.
Yeah, Phoebe, to that note, prior to this role at UVA, I was working abroad in Thessaloniki, Greece, facilitating a first semester program. And one of my favorite experiences was riding the jam-packed bus with armpits in my face and hearing Greek all around me. And yeah, in addition to being sustainable and, you know, appreciating the local culture, it was also just really fun.
So I want to second what Phoebe just said, and I think it is exactly the way, and it speaks to what David mentioned earlier as well. The immersive experience is critical if we want to promote any kind of cultural sustainability. And different places have such unique cultures, and which makes it all the more challenging, but all the more important.
I was trying to think of the single thing that has put me out of my comfort zone in a great way. And I think to Fu's point, like, or Haley maybe mentioned, public transportation, right? Walking, buses that are public. The areas that have been most cut off has been like when you get a tour bus and everyone has their seat on the bus. And I mean, it's beautiful air conditioning, right? And you go in and you get dropped off and you get back on. That can be isolating. So I think there's something nice to the stream of thinking about, if I were to travel the city or live here, how would I travel? So metro, bus, taxi, walking. It's less efficient, but it's I think it's just quicker to get you outside of your bubble in a powerful way.
And I think that approach could be taken too in how you select your accommodation. So, you know, in Thessaloniki, locals are not using air conditioning. And in fact, a lot of my Greek coworkers would ask if I was using air conditioning, if I said I thought I was getting a cold or something like that. So doing what you can to mimic the way the people live around you goes a long way.
And a lot of times those kind of things are more sustainable as well, you know, using public transportation or using less electricity. And, you know, public transportation being, you know, from the US, depending where you're from, you may not be used to having readily accessible, and depending where you're going, it may not be, but definitely something to make sure you're considering as part of your local orientation before you go, whether you're on a program or traveling or doing research. So we have another question for our panelists. Oh, go ahead, Spencer.
I was going to say one thing I definitely learned the first time through the study abroad course was for the next time is to ease up on the schedule. I mean, we packed in so much, and we had, as a result, we had a lot of, you know, travel in between, and logistics took time to get from place to place. And next time around, we'll actually be in 2 fewer places where we have to unpack our bags and lay down our heads. And so there'll just be more hanging out time and more opportunities to explore areas in an unstructured way. And that leads more to the alternative transportation, instead of everything having to be, you know, like go, get on the coach, get off at the office, get back on the coach, go back to the dinner, whatever. Of course, there's also university risk management prerogatives that have to be obeyed, and, you know, Vietnam is the kingdom of the motorbike, and so that's officially off limits as a mode of transportation for our students too, but it's definitely a big part of the culture. But walking is pretty good second best.
Yeah, I really agree with the the timing issue, or, that it's the journey, right? It's not the destination in these programs. And this expectation that you've got to, take the most efficient thing to get you as quickly as possible, and just undermines, I think, so many of the intentions of these experiences.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that I've taken the motorcycle in Ho Chi Minh City, and I know exactly what Spencer was talking in terms of like sitting at the back and going. That is an experience.
Well, we were taking the bus back into Hanoi from Cat Ba Island, and I promised my students I would buy drinks for at dinner for the student who found the most outlandish thing on a motorbike. And the winner was, 4 men on a motorbike, and the man on the very back had no arms. And we were just trying to figure out the logic that went into that arrangement.
Okay.
But, and but that beat out the, like load of plywood type of thing. So.
Well, one thing about, I don't know if I should say this, but I mean, one thing about the risk management, sometimes things just happen that weren't planned too.
Indeed.
When we were traveling in India, we did travel by auto rickshaw, or tuk-tuks, which we weren't supposed to do, but there were just times where we needed to get from one place to another, and it was the only way to really move around Delhi,
Yep.
So I don't know, being maybe a little bit spontaneous sometimes has to happen too. Haley, do not repeat that.
Right. We had a little don't ask, don't tell with the motorbikes in Vietnam, I think.
So taking some of these lessons, how can we all engage in education abroad and international work in a way that promotes sustainability? We've already said, taking public transportation, or, turning off your air conditioning or your heat, opening a window instead. But are there other lessons or suggestions?
This is kind of a easy one for me because the whole course was built around ecological economics and sustainability in the place we were. And so we were there studying it. We were not making a long-term commitment, but we weren't there simply as a cultural exchange, or not that there'd be anything wrong with that, but we weren't touring. We were there to study and learn and to try to come up with ways of thinking through how would we develop solutions for the stuff we were seeing. And students came to the course with a topic area in mind, but without data and without their models necessarily. And so we learned those over the course of the program. But we were working on solving problems there, which hopefully will, seed thinking about sustainability challenges elsewhere.
Yeah, I guess I agree with that. The ability of like research and internships and ways of, contributing when you're abroad. The other thing I was thinking about, which is maybe controversial, but, carbon offsets, for instance, for flying abroad. So I know the UBA International Studies Office developed a plan last year to think about how do we, offset the impact of students specifically flying, I think, largely flying abroad, or also faculty research and things like that. And so, I think the problem with carbon offsets, of course, is getting the right offsets and that they're really doing what you hope. But I was interested in, and correct me if I'm wrong, Haley, but last I knew, the International Studies Office was getting offsets with one of our research partners in Morocco, the High Atlas Foundation, which plants trees and does environmental restoration. And so, if you can partner with someone, ideally someone you even do programs or research with for those offsets, then you're both, you're contributing in a really positive way and building a long-term partnership.
Yeah, that's right. And we will be assessing and evaluating this offset program with our new partner and seeing how it goes, and possibly other units are looking at expanding that for their own purposes, which is really cool. But hopefully, you know, as we share with other, you know, interested institutions on how to go about this, the key was looking again internally at existing partnerships and, you know, pouring into things that we're already investing in.
I mean, I think that's the question, at least I ask myself when I think about taking students abroad or, you know, for research or for an education, a semester long kind of program is, well, should we just stay here from a sustainability standpoint? Like, is it really a good idea to be flying halfway around the world for 2 weeks? Or, you know, it seems like the longer the period, the more dispersed the impact or the more reduced the impact.
Mhm.
But, you know, it's a big question. And I guess my own way of thinking about it is that, well, yeah, I'm not going to do it all the time, but that the learning that happens is so rich and important that it is worth it if you do it in a thoughtful way.
Yeah, and who knows what impact students participating in that program will go on to have after as a result of that experience. So
That's the key, I think.
Mm-hmm.
I also have another follow-up question, and you know, for anyone else in the audience too, but are there any anything you learned during your travels that you've brought back that's now part of like your daily routine that are more sustainable, like opening a window before you turn on the air conditioning or something like that, and maybe sharing some of those lessons that you've made part of your normal routine now?
Yeah, I like that question. And for me, that gets at the root of study abroad. Like, what do we bring back ultimately, and how do we change? For me, I think, well, just gratitude for a lot of the blessings I have of like a house and support. That has actually blessed my life a lot during COVID this past year. It's let me refocus on what's really important. Because it's eye-opening just to realize how much that I take for granted that I have. So that's more of emotional well-being, but that's been really helpful. But I have changed my practice. I know water has come up a couple times for me. So taking care of water usage has been a big personal change that I've had. I know we're in Virginia and we're in Williamsburg, Charlottesville, we get a lot of rain, but it has impacted how I use it and how I think about reuse. So yeah, I think both on the emotional side, but also in some physical, tangible ways, I've tried to update my behavior based on my experiences abroad.
Yeah, for me, it would be related to water usage, cutting down plastic. I was talking to Phoebe in the breakout room about the experience that she had in India about using reusable cups and cups that would compost and stuff. So those are some of the things that I try to like bring back with me when I come back.
For me, you know, definitely selection of housing here in Charlottesville after 3 years overseas. And, you know, my criterion was I need to be able to walk to grounds when it's too icy for me to ride my bicycle. So that, you know, kept me in the denser part of this city, which is, you know, a couple of orders of magnitude smaller than the one I was moving from. But, you know, definitely when you live in a big urban environment, you feel the pain of commuting in a lot of ways, whether it's more time in the polluted air or just more time that it takes to get from place to place. So being able to walk, being able to bicycle is definitely a choice I've made that's informed partially by my times overseas.
Yeah, I think maybe this is following a little bit on David's comment too. Like for me, the appreciation of limited resources and scarcity, and that, you know, we live in a culture, if you're living in the US, where, you know, there's like an embarrassment of riches, that it's just too much of everything. And so it's very easy to think that happiness and well-being comes from buying stuff or consuming stuff or, you know, having choice and all of those things. And then if you spend time in a country where there is a lot less choice, you go to the grocery store and there are 2 things to choose from for shampoo instead of 100, or 2 things, you know, whatever it is. And you realize that people are with their families and their friends and they're having loving relationships and they're studying and they're working and they're having very fulfilling lives, and it's not all centered around consumption. And so I don't know, every time that I go someplace with far less kind of easy access to resources like that, I come back, feeling very grateful and thankful and really thinking, you know, trying to like renew my commitment to living lighter on the land in some way, because it can get really easy to just be like immersed in this stuff, you know. So I don't know, that's the biggest one for me, and that goes from everything from water to waste to food to transportation to housing to whatever.
Yeah, what Phoebe said reminds me of the first time the first state I visited in the US was Texas. Don't ask me why, it's a long story. But so I go, and I distinctly remember going to a restaurant and ordering breakfast. And what I got was breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And I kept
For a
thinking to
family of
myself,
4, right?
yes. And I was like, what is happening?
Yeah, I think food is definitely one that we haven't really talked much about, but in the US, it's very meat forward. You know, you have your meat with every meal, and a lot of my travels, it's maybe you don't, or it's like a little bit of it is like part of it, but it's not the main portion of your meal. And, you know, my family and I have kind of switched to being more plant-based with some meat every now and then. And it's nice to see that as like a cultural shift now too here in the US, but that's something that, you know, I noticed I picked up along the way, and we just don't really eat as much. And it's, you know, food is at the heart of every culture as well. And that's a really great way to do that immersive deep dive into the local culture, is trying your local food too. And that's always been one of my favorite parts. But have there been any lessons from any of our audience members that you guys want to share with us? We want to hear some of your stories too.
I actually have a question, if that's okay. Could you share a little bit about how you envision sustainability abroad travel plans, if you do have any in the near future? Like, because of COVID, I know a lot of things have changed and posed a lot of questions. But if you do have any future travel plans, could you talk a little bit about that? Thank you.
Do you mean more broadly, like through each of the universities, or specifically?
I guess for university-led sustainability abroad travel plans. Yeah.
So I can say at William and Mary, we've had students going abroad on non-faculty led programs through third parties and providers. But we are hoping to have our first faculty-led group go out in January, which would be very exciting. But we are trying to build in more of that sustainability into program development and have questions about it when we have new programs being applied for by faculty. Thinking about how we're including that in our pre-courses and orientations for students, whether they're on a faculty-led program or not. Making sure we're adding those resources in for students, whether they're going on a study abroad program, they're going for research, vacation. We have some additional resources out there, and just trying to build it in as part of the normal structure to travel.
Yeah, and I can say Marina and I have been coordinating on that effort of building in resources for students to educate themselves and be sustainability savvy, if you will. In terms of our program offerings, our first term abroad, where we sent students abroad again, was this past summer. Right now we have about 100 students abroad, which is very exciting. In terms of our UVA programs, we're not running J-term programs, but are currently building out our summer 2022 offerings. And hopefully there will be a couple programs available with a focus on sustainability. So yeah, you can head to our website and check out some more.
Thank you.
Right.
We also try to host a sustainable programs highlight once a semester, where we highlight some programs that focus specifically on climate change or sustainable development or things like that. So if you're a student interested in a program like that, we'll host one early in the spring semester. So look for those events.
Yeah, and even if sustainability isn't what you're looking for academically, we provide a framework, Marina and I, to kind of assess how sustainable or not a given program is by asking questions like, are there vegan meal options or vegetarian meal options, and what kind of travel is required on grounds on the program? Like, is it all flight-based, or is some public transportation based, or trains or buses or things like that? So there's a whole list of questions, and it's certainly not black and white. And some programs are just more sustainable than others.
Are there any other questions? I know we just have a few more minutes.
Well, since we didn't talk much about food, and Haley just mentioned it with, vegan options, in our experience in Vietnam anyway, is very meat forward. And also a lot of meals when we wanted to have something more traditional, which we were almost exclusively, except I guess students could do Western style food on their own when it was free meals, is communal dishes, like a table laden with dishes, and you would select from them. And the result of having vegetarians and vegans in the group was that they ended up sort of like having to sit in the vegan ghetto, the other table, and then it was like the kiddie table, and we had the other tables. And so we didn't have enough or as much mixing of the students together as we needed to. And it occurred to me in planning this for the second time around, I was like, well, we'll just go to some vegan restaurants. It's a lot easier to have everybody eat vegan than to force the vegans to eat meat. So we can certainly accommodate that within it. But also, vegans should be prepared to see all kinds of foods out there. So we didn't eat any dog, but everything else was available.
Well, are there any other questions from our audience members this afternoon? If not, I guess we will go ahead and wrap up and say thanks for attending this session, and a big, big thank you to our panelists for sharing about your experiences abroad and your experience leading programs and everything like that. And we're excited to continue rebounding and getting students abroad in the semesters to come.
Thanks so much.
All right.
This has made me want to go.
Yeah, really.
Perfect.
I mean, go somewhere, not leave.
Not leave the Zoom meeting.
No. Sorry.
All right. Thanks all.
Thanks so much, everyone.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Thank you. Thank you for having us.